Belgrade, 1990. This is the story of Ex-Cess. But it's also the untold story of Belgrade hardcore. So let's back up a little. While geographically in Eastern Europe, former Yugoslavia was not a part of the Soviet Eastern Bloc, but rather existed as a member of the non-aligned movement. Meaning, unlike the rest of Eastern European countries, Yugoslavs were not behind the Iron Curtain and could freely travel the world. This allowed for a free flow of cultural exchange with the West, which meant that art, literature, cinema, but most of all music from the West, found its way to Yugoslavia not long after it was published abroad. On their part, the Western world perceived Yugoslavia as a benevolent dictatorship, and due to its favorable geostrategic importance during the Cold War, turned a blind eye to what they would otherwise describe as a totalitarian communist regime. The origins of new wave and punk in former Yugoslavia date as far back as there's been punk, and have been well documented. By the early 90s, Yugoslavia's capital, Belgrade, was a thriving metropolis with one of the most vibrant underground music scenes in Europe. Some 60-plus local underground bands were actively gigging, recording, and publishing material, forming a scene that encompassed underground radio and TV shows, various music publications, and a myriad of fanzines. But the phenomenon of the Belgrade underground scene was probably the most evident in its live shows, with dozens of bands regularly playing to packed venues. Punk rock, garage, oi, anarcho, crust, doom, sludge, trash, crossover, industrial, psych, skate, grind, Krishna, melodic, straight edge, goth punk, pop punk, rapcore, slowcore, you name it, Belgrade had it. Unlike their Western counterparts, Belgrade punk bands were mostly anti-communist, which at that time in Yugoslavia basically translated to the same overall anti-establishment sentiment, a crux of punk worldwide. Many of the local bands used the growing scene to voice these views, which did not go unnoticed by the communist regime. The statement of punk culture was becoming bigger than the music. This particular generation of groups creatively peaked somewhere around 1991, which coincided with the onset of civil war in former Yugoslavia, spreading from Slovenia to Croatia and Bosnia. By 1993, brutal national conflict and the abject poverty of war had taken its toll and all but destroyed the culture of a generation. But that's a whole other story. This particular story is actually just about one of those bands, Ex-Cess. The idea of Ex-Cess dates back to high school around 1987, but the first studio demos were not recorded until '89. By the beginning of 1990, Ex-Cess was in full swing, playing the club circuit and building a following. As their level of musicianship grew, the band gradually came into their own, and evolved from straightforward punk rock to a much faster and heavier style, morphing into a curious sonic blend brought on by an unusually wide array of influences between the band members. Simultaneously, they drew attention with mature, intelligent lyrics, covering socio-political issues from street life, police brutality, anti-conscription, and asinine violence, to introspective stories of alienation, young adulthood, systematic abandonment, and love. Ex-Cess began to garner reluctant media attention.
Diabolik gleda kroz prozor skroka. kad čovjek stoji na ivici i urla.
Mnogi ljudi u susjedstva treba prisati, susjedstva nara, stige rođeni, čekajući nekog diaboli koda. Da sam se poglednikao.
But almost all of their television appearances were cut short due to technical difficulties. The band embraced this as an inside joke, while their live shows became notorious, if not outright dangerous.
Na penu, a mrču momci, gitare, glase, a niko ne zna da radjaču tišenu. 106, promene nešto, 106, promene nešto, 106, promene nešto, 106.
Over the next 2 years, they performed in every major city in the region, but as the Civil War progressed, restrictions on travel made touring impossible. In the fall of '91, Ex-Cess entered the studio to record an EP, but in somewhat of a premonition, on a whim, decided to record a 14-song set instead. The material was recorded live in one day, mixed the next day, and as an ironic commentary on devastating war circumstances, they mockingly titled the record Eternal Life Insurance Policy. Soon thereafter, it became more or less impossible to actively continue playing.
Ovo što ovdje vidite, to je Ex-Cess, tako piše, a šta se večeras dešava, reći će nam drugu prvo koji se nalazi pored mene.
Večeras se dešava svirka u KST-u i ja bi pozvao ovako sve ljude, nije bitno na muzičkom opredeljenju, punkere, metalce, hipike i sve ostale da dođu da, pošto mislim kako je vreme došlo, verovatno neće moći nekoliko meseci da se svira i tako.
The band was forced into hiatus, and in hope of things blowing over, 3 out of the 4 band members temporarily left the country, only never to return. Meanwhile, one lone Ex-Cess tape makes its way to Croatia, where it gets published by a small independent label, Ill in the Head Records. This marked the first publication of a Serbian band in Croatia since the beginning of the Civil War. The lo-fi sped-up bootlegs of these cassette tapes eventually made their way to the internet, and that's where this story ends. Well, almost. Fast forward nearly 30 years later, this same small indie label, only now based in Toronto, manages to track down the band members in North America. The thought-to-be-lost DAT master tape of the album was amazingly unearthed somewhere in Belgrade, remastered, and prepared for a vinyl reissue. So, at last, for the first time ever, we are pleased to announce that the album, Eternal Life Insurance Policy, will finally be available